if we voluntarily disclose, are we going to be safe from enforcement action? And the response was, well, not necessarily, especially if there are aggravating factors, and we may know information about you that you don't know.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, folks, we're ready for a wrap-up of the BIS conference. We're going to do this on our SimplyTrade podcast. And today we have Lindsay Forbes from the phenomenal law firm of Schultz Trade Law, I believe is how the official term is. It's Michelle Schultz. If those of you that have heard us talk about it, Michelle's been on a show a few times, and I'm looking forward to hog tying her down and getting her back on the show again. So, but for right now, we have recently been a lot of folks been attending a couple of conferences. One in particular is the BIS conference, which was, if I'm Lindsay, help me out here. Was it in Philadelphia? Was that right this year? DC. Oh, okay. All right. So one was in Philly and the other's in DC. So BIS was in DC, I guess. Okay. So with that, you attended it. So first off, why don't you give folks a little bit of what your official title is and what you do or your responsibilities there at the Schultz Law Firm?
Sure. I'm a senior associate attorney with Schultz Trade Law here in Dallas, Texas. We are a woman-owned, all-female lawyer law firm at the moment, and we do everything trade-related. So imports, exports, sanctions, defense services, pretty much everything in the trade space we handle. And fortunately, because Michelle is such a good mentor, she's gotten me involved in all of those different areas. My background is in exports and sanctions. I worked on a corporate monitorship for a company that had been convicted of export violations. So that's how I got into the space. Yes, it was, I was a litigator. So I'm a reformed litigator. Now I will never go back. Trade law is where I want to sit. But really, I'm handling every type of case that trade law throws at us, which is a wild and amazing ride, especially these days.
Yeah, it's like one wild and crazy time. Okay. All right. But there's all kinds of, all right. So here's something that I would love, if you don't mind, I'm going to plant a seed with you. We have a show. Actually, Michelle's done one of these, and we've had a few others. George Tuttle did them. But we will ask an attorney to pick a case where somebody has been convicted and we call it our SimplyTrade's crimes. So why don't you, at some point in the future, if you have the, as we would say, have the hankering for it, pick a case that you can, it's obviously public record at that point, and we can go through and pretty much get to the point of like, what were they thinking? I would love. We've had some things where people have been doing cases predominantly on the imports, but I would love to see about exports and all that. So, all right. So your expertise is, yeah, and especially from a standpoint of, people think it's pretty innocent trying to take care of their customer, and the shipment itself becomes a routed transaction. And it's like, okay, red flags start going up. I mean, routed transactions are a medium for moving something, but you better know who you're dealing with, and because liabilities don't go away.
Right. If it's the deal of a lifetime in this political environment, maybe I don't not think so much. If all your competitors are saying, "Ooh, we better get out of here," and you think, "Oh, great market opportunity for me," maybe you better think twice about it.
Have I got a deal for you?
Right.
Red flags.
We won this amazing contract. Oh yeah, red flag. It's just
yeah. 3-day event. I had some keynote speakers. Anything in particular that came up that, as far as the speakers, that was either surprising or very important to take note of here?
So as per usual, we had Assistant Secretary Matt Axelrod give an address at the conference. And the main reason that I like to go to this conference, other than catching up with all of my friends, is because he will drop some fresh knowledge and for some fresh policies during that speech. And the theme of the conference this year was partnerships in national and global security, which built a lot off of the year before. So I think it was 2022. They had to push back 2023, which was building a network of global cooperation. So the emphasis, for the most part, from what I heard from BIS representatives, was interagency cooperation, international cooperation, and industry cooperation. Those were the points that they were really trying to drive home. And
so, all right, go through that again. Industry cooperation, corporate, you said, and go ahead.
Interagency, international, and industry. 3 I's.
All right. So with that, the interagency comes into play where it sounds like there, and I have seen some other things, and I'll mention that in just a second, but I've seen some like emails and announcements on some things, but interagency would be the connotation of multiple agencies literally collaborating in an effort to, I guess, for enforcement activities. Would that be fair?
Yes, for sure. So BIS talked a lot about the new disruptive technology strike force and the successes that they've had with their investigations. They're working with the Department of Justice and Homeland Security, and I believe there's one more agency that was recently added. So that was one of the focuses of their interagency. But also they were highlighting that defense, state, treasury, justice are all going to be involved in these reviews and warning industry that they'll be cooperating. One of the more fascinating things I heard, much to people's dismay, I think, was in a Q&A session after the last BIS plenary. And someone had asked, if we voluntarily disclose, are we going to be safe from enforcement action? And the response was, well, not necessarily, especially if there are aggravating factors, and we may know information about you that you don't know. And a lot of that is coming from interagency cooperation. Yeah.
Drop the mic on that one. I bet that is like there were crickets after that, or either that, or there was a lot of ooh.
I looked over at Kelly McCorkle. She's been on this podcast, and she's our senior trade advisor at Schultz Trade Law, and I just gave her big eyes, like ooh, uh-oh. But it's true. It's so true. I mean, we've seen it in a couple of our cases where the government knows things that our clients didn't know, or at least didn't tell us. I like to think that they didn't know. And then you have these sky-high whistleblower rewards coming out. The OFAC whistleblower rewards, I can't even remember, but it's a pretty decent chunk if the recovery is over $1 million. So you have all these potential sources of information from government agencies and from your internal people, and the encouragement from BIS of companies to rat each other out. There are so many sources of information that are flowing into the government. And it was you better watch out. We're the government. We're here to help, but
yeah, right.
Watch out.
Yeah, it's like whenever that says, it's like, grab your wallet and look over your back. Okay. All that to say then with this, the key though is as we're talking through doing international trade, and if you are exporting commodities, selling goods around the world, the key that you've got to look at here is just make sure you're crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And if you're doing that, pretty much you're going to be in good shape. Well, part of the crossing of the T's and dotting of the I's would be, I would have to think, is vetting who are you doing business with, whether they're a supplier whether they're a customer, whether they're a distributor, third party scenario there, or whatever, is there have been so many additions to the restricted parties and denied party screening list, if you will, that it would be smart to have multiple screenings, because all of that happens so quickly. Is that, sometimes the carriers are doing it. I know express carriers are doing it. Freight forwarders and brokers should be doing it. But even yourself having that incorporated, that to me would be one of the first, I guess, things you need to consider when you're doing business, just to see what you're dealing with as far as your customer base, running names through, your databases, like your accounts, payable, accounts receivable type entities and all that. Is that something that I'm like, it's like, no, Andy, that you're pounding sand there. It's not going to do anything, or is it going to be something to say, no, this is probably a legitimate request there for people to do?
Oh, absolutely. You want to know your customer, but you also want to know your vendors. You want to know the banks. You want to know the freight forwarders. You want to know every single party in this transaction, because you're absolutely right. These regulations and the restricted party lists from various agencies are changing day by day. It's best practice for companies to have automated screening processes, and that's cost prohibitive for a lot of entities. But on the flip side, for example, the consolidated screening list that has the OFAC list, BIS, et cetera, that updates every morning at 5 a.m. Eastern, I think. So if you're not pulling that list and screening all of your business partners every day, then you're at a really high risk of ending up in a situation you don't want to be in. So it's definitely hugely important. And then one of the hot knowledge surprises that we got from BIS is that the Office of Anti-Boycott Compliance has been maintaining a list of people who have made boycott requests. I think last year they changed the form where you have to not only identify the country where the boycott request came from, but also who did it. And for now, they've been keeping it a secret, but they just dropped the list and named and shamed everybody. So we've got
let's back up a minute here before we go any further. Why don't you explain that a little bit? Some folks are talking about it as, are you doing that in the States? You doing that around, or what? Explain that a little bit to, somebody like myself is like dumb as a box of rocks. You almost have to draw pictures here, but I understand the boycott scenario where, all right, there's this collaborative effort to not do business with a person or an entity or company or whatever. How is that in relation to the U.S. government and what you're just talking about?
Sure. So in the Export Administration context, anti-boycott is referring to U.S. people being prohibited from complying with boycotts that the U.S. doesn't agree with. So the largest example of this is boycotts of Israel. And predominantly you see these issues coming from companies in the Middle East, but we were told at Update that we're now seeing a lot of it coming from Malaysia and other manufacturing economies that are manufacturing goods on behalf of some of these other countries. So if you receive a request, and that request can come in any form, it can be an email, it can be contract language, anything at all really, to comply with an unsanctioned boycott. Let's say, for example, someone says, you need to promise me that you aren't going to send me any goods that were manufactured in Israel. You need to report that to the Office of Anti-Boycott Compliance at BIS. Otherwise, you can get in significant trouble. Even if you don't comply, you have to report the request. And now OFAC is requiring you to name and shame the request. So historically, where you could have said, oh, my customer in Bahrain requested that I include contract language saying we won't ship these goods to Israel, or we won't purchase goods from Israel. You only had to say Bahrain, I think I said, or whatever the country was. Now you have to say who did it. And the Office of Anti-Boycott Compliance has been sitting on that list, and they just decided to drop it. So now it's public who has made these requests.
Well, here's a question that would be curious to me, would be on that list, although I'm not sure you could even answer this, but it's like for those that have been reported as trying to push for some kind of a boycott, again, like you said, of Israel or other countries or other issues, would come down as like, are any of those on the restricted or denied party screening?
I would imagine there is some overlap. I haven't done the comparison between the lists to see. I think for the most part, though, it's going to be people who aren't restricted parties, because typically, if you're doing your transaction compliance checkpoints correctly, you're not going to be transacting with a restricted party to begin with. So it's very possible that these entities are not already on BIS entity list or military end user lists. They've been cleared from that standpoint. It's when it comes to the contract negotiation or the quotation phase or letter of credit issues that this will pop up. So I can't say for certain, but my gut feeling is there's probably a little bit of overlap, but for the most part, maybe not.
All right. Well, with that, let me just stop for a second. Folks, to our listeners here, is that a key point of action that came out of this discussion here with Lindsay about what was mentioned during the BIS is, how to deal with, boycott request. And the only way you're going to get that's really going to come to your senior executive levels. That's going to come to your front line. So with that, that's something that you probably need to make a concerted effort. Action, hear what I'm saying. Your action point here is you probably need to do a recurrency training and do it quickly on these types of things. So that's one that to put on there, how to handle, what is considered a boycott request and what should you do with it, and who within your company and your bureaucracy that you want to set up within your company, how should those things be handled? All right, Lindsay. So that's a big one right there. It seems kind of small.
It's a big one,
but that's a big one.
It's really, it's going to be hard on those companies that were named too, because they may not have known that they were going to be on this list. And now all of a sudden there are subsidiaries of US companies, which is awkward to say the least. And BIS didn't say specifically you can't do business with these people, but it was enough of a hint of maybe you should think twice. So there are really significant reputational and commercial consequences for either making these requests or for missing that they even happened.
Government's going to be sharing data that is gathered from you, from your shipments, from your, the companies, whatever. I would have to say, interagency. So you're looking at customs, you're looking at, the State Department. I'm sure you're looking at, different OFAC. You just talked about the anti-boycott. What about the IRS?
Oh, they didn't mention the IRS specifically, but I don't see why not. Right? I don't see why not.
It's under the veil. We're the government. We can do whatever we want and share information, right. Whether, Right.
And then, publicly available information too. All of the regulators and enforcement agencies have access to Google. So they
social
find a lot
media,
of their information that way.
Whatever.
Yes.
Yep. News releases.
They did highlight that they find a lot of their information from publicly available sites. Actually, one of the most interesting things that I learned about the investigations process is that for Chinese companies specifically, often you want to have a Mandarin speaker or someone who can at least read and understand the language look at the Chinese webpage, because BIS said that the English-facing page and the Chinese-facing page will say different things sometimes. So the language will be tailored on the English side to look like it's compliant, but on the Chinese side, it'll illuminate more about potential ties with military, promotion of the civil military fusion policy, that sort of stuff. So I thought that was fascinating.
Interesting. There's a lot to this as we're getting into it, and most people would think, as far as dealing with export, if you are selling product, you also need to make sure you may be selling to a domestic customer, which is great. But then there's also the issue, what are you doing with my product? Because you want to make sure that your terms of sale, and I say terms in this, I'm not talking payment terms, is that the sale is conditional that these goods stay in the U.S. or these goods will not be sent to some nefarious country or whatever, or be used in some kind of nefarious use, whatever. Is that pretty fair based on what you're seeing here?
Yes, for sure. And it's difficult for industry because there's only so much you can do. You can't control if a customer or a supplier is lying to you. But the government is expecting, with the wealth of information that's publicly available, social media, news, websites, data analytics software. I don't want to name any to promote them, but there are softwares out there that will show you relationships among different parties, and then even Google Maps, looking at the map. If that information is out there, they're going to expect you to know it, even if it isn't part of your practice, to look at it. Another thing would be IP addresses from emails. I typically, when I receive an email, my first thought isn't, I should go check the IP address that this came from to make sure that's not in a prohibited destination. But that's the level that the government is looking at industry to comply with.
You're saying is that the IT department is very rarely contacted in a proactive manner on, dealing with things with supply chain and sourcing and those kinds of things. But yet, in what we're talking about here is there are some things that the IT department can do and would do in their firewalls and different things as far as messages coming in, that it can check to see where those IP addresses are and, flag them, whatever, and put them and contain them, or at least flag them from receiving an email from somebody that may not necessarily be illegal, but you need to have it flagged to say you need to be, extra cautious here on what's going on.
Right. This customer says that they're located in Slovakia, but they're pinging a IP address that's in Russia, or they say that they're in Saudi Arabia, but they're pinging a location that's in Iran. Now, a lot of ne'er-do-wells are going to have the forethought to use a VPN, but still you want to be checking that. And you mentioned IT. IT has a huge role in trade compliance, making sure that servers are secure, restricting access to control technology. If you have control technology, making sure those servers are hosted in the US, figuring out who has access to what. The best practice for a compliance program is to have it transcend all levels of the organization. And there are a lot of departments that people don't typically think is having a role. HR is another, or people management. I'm not sure what most people use now, but those relationships with departments outside of procurement and sales and finance are really, really important and are becoming increasingly more important now.
One of the things that would be smart, some companies have done this, and the question is how effective they are, lends itself to the participants and what issues they bring up and how they coordinate all that. And that is putting together, some call it a trade council, some call it a supply chain council, some call it, a transportation council, something like that. But it's where there's a representative from multiple facets of the company. And you start talking over issues. Case in point, hey, we're going to talk a little bit about the Red Sea situation and where the Houthis out of Yemen are attacking cargo ships. does that affect us? And let's go through and deal with it. Any suppliers in the Middle East or any customers or any whatever. And you talk through the issues, and most people, oh, that doesn't bother us. And then somebody else goes, oh, well, wait a minute. No, we have so-and-so that has a secondary company that goes in there, or whatever the case may be. And so I would think that this would be one of those. IT needs to be represented as well. And as you get through it. So, okay. So with the collaboration of the government and whatever, anything else that came out of the BIS conference speeches and sessions?
All sorts of stuff. The other three issues that Assistant Secretary Axelrod talked about, new policy developments, are publishing new freight forwarder guidance for best practices, which I think is going to be helpful. And in the context of our discussion earlier about anti-boycott compliance, BIS is going hard on anti-boycott enforcement, and they will be issuing penalties. So this new guidance includes anti-boycott compliance advice for freight forwarders, which is great. Because, they may not necessarily be thinking, oh, I need to be worrying about this provision of the export regulations. They also published a new Don't Let This Happen to You, which is everybody's favorite document from BIS, I think.
That's the one that I'm going to get Michelle on the show with, and we're going to go into a little bit more minutia on that one. So, all right,
yeah.
So
that's good. And then the last one is BIS said that they've been sending red flag letters to companies when their business partners have been flagged as illegally diverting goods to Russia or to other sanctioned destinations, but primarily Russia. And now they said that they're going to be starting to send publicly available resources and information that they found to the original manufacturers saying, hey, these particular companies are of concern to us for diversion. You should be careful and really, really think very hard about whether you want your products to end up there. So it's not a prohibition on you can't do business with them, but in their red flag letters that they're sending, they're now asking people to voluntarily stop shipments. So it's like a very personal, don't let this happen to you red flags guidance sent directly to your mailbox.
Well, and to that point, let me say that one of the indicators that if you're trying to transact business, and so we've not gotten into the anti-boycott scenario there, but the other question that should raise a red flag is you're thinking, okay, this is going to, some country in Europe or wherever. Okay, fine. But if somebody then goes in and says, okay, in the sale of this, we don't want to use US dollars in the transaction. We want to use the Chinese yuan or the, something else, even Russian rubles or whatever it is. That right there ought to be a red flag going, okay, somebody's trying to circumvent the Western countries' banking sanctions and things of that nature. The BRICS initiative with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I believe Saudi Arabia even. Even some of those countries are allies with the U.S. They're trying to move away from using the U.S. dollar on international transactions. That right there tells you, let me look at this and consider, and maybe I need to raise this issue up the chain. Is this, hey, it's a good sale. It's a great, business situation. Is it too good to be true? I don't know.
Yeah, it depends on your customer and your situation, of course. Some transactions, it's going to make perfect sense for you to transact in euros, for example. But if someone's asking you to transact in Chinese renminbi, so RMB, not the yuan, I saw an article come out recently that there are very few legitimate transactions done in RMB outside of China, and most of them are with Iran. So if you've got RMB in there, you want to take a closer look, for sure.
That's something else that, again, the IT department can come into play. Everybody can have their best intentions. You've got your processes, but you could put in edits and flags and things of that nature in your systems so that, let's say, a sales order, a purchase order, or a customer order goes through and it starts doing the frequency, the currency, and you start selecting that. You may want the transaction to move through your company, but it raises a flag for somebody to say, hey, I need to see some oversight of this. And it flags it automatically because you want to see what happens in this versus if you just stop it at the beginning. Yeah, you avoid some things, but there may be other issues that are going on. If I were an executive, I would want to know, hey, red flag it, let the right people have oversight of this. You can always stop it before, well, they have to approve it before it goes on further. The point being, talk to me. What's the liability? Who are we dealing with? Yes, it's a legitimate deal. Maybe I need to reach out to the State Department on this one or whomever. We have this sale transaction. This was the request. It looks innocent. Do you know something we don't? And I think the government would greatly appreciate that.
Yes, and I believe the shareholders of the entity you work for would also greatly appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, training across departments is really important. Again, you can't just have a compliance manual that's only tailored to your people who are doing your imports and your exports because they're not involved in all stages of the process. Finance may be the only one who's truly looking at a letter of credit that might have boycott language in it, or a strange currency, or a different bank attached to it than was being told to your commercial team, right? You just don't know. And it's hard to get, especially smaller companies, to buy into that because it's expensive. Compliance is expensive. But BIS's Axelrod's big thing was we want front-end compliance, and if you don't have front-end compliance, we're going to have back-end enforcement.
Is that people have many times traditionally waited till there was a problem, and then you're like the pooper scooper at the end of a parade, and it's like, you know what? I want to feed the beast, not clean up after it, because if you don't do it right, you're going to get it on the back end, and it'll cost you more. So, okay, all that to say, what else as far as your thoughts and impressions here?
Very similar to last year, it was very clear that the U.S. government agencies involved in trade are coming down hard against Russia and coming down hard against PRC. So there were separate sessions on China-specific updates and Russia-specific updates, but it's very clear that this is still, these are still two priority areas of regulation for the United States right now, which makes sense. We heard that licenses to these destinations are probably going to take longer than they have historically because they're getting caught up in this interagency review. The Department of Defense in particular has said that they're going through a lot of this stuff with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that there's no technology or products that are going to people that shouldn't be. So Russia and China, big focus right now. China, especially in the semiconductor context. These semiconductor sessions were the only warm rooms in this entire conference because there were people stacked in there. So many that there needed to be overflow rooms for semiconductors. And there were representatives from dang near every major technology company you can think of. And the industry attendance at this conference was incredible. But yeah, people were very excited and apprehensive about the semiconductor session. So that's another big one.
Well, and that's one too that, quite frankly, with the things going on, first off, of recent there, you were talking about China, and there's the U.S. and the U.K. had, it was published that they had launched and made some arrests. They've made some accusations and issued warrants and a few other things regarding a China cyber espionage situation. and it has involved millions and millions of people and companies and whatnot. And it has to do with, tapping into emails, systems and phone records and, financial transactions and all kinds of stuff. So with that, I can see where that would become a key concern. Then you add on top of that this scenario here with, again, where are your goods going? One of the things that Michelle mentioned, so I'm going to give you the opportunity here, Lindsay, is that if I'm doing business and now I have an international customer or I'm buying something internationally and having it brought in, but especially if I'm selling it and whatnot, there are clauses Michelle made mention of, so you got to make sure that's in your contract. Still doesn't guarantee everything, but it at least helps protect you. So can you elaborate maybe a little bit of what along that line that falls in line with this, the issues you went into BIS? Is that something that should be, you can protect yourself?
You could try. So my philosophy is you always want to identify the 4 Ps and have them covered in your transaction, which are person, product, place, purpose. So you want to know your customer. You want to know where it's going. You want to know, and especially in the semiconductor and advanced computing sector, what it is, what is the technology, what is the level of control, who can it go to, who can it go to, and then the purpose, because we're seeing increased additions of military end users and facilitators of prohibited military end uses being added to BIS MEU list, sanctions lists. So you want to make sure you cover all of those. And those will include things like destination control statements in your quotes, your invoices, whatever you can slap that thing on, however much notice you can give to your business partner that we comply with U.S. export control law and sanctions and FCPA, we expect you to as well, giving them all of the notice and opportunity. Because if the government ever comes asking, you can say, look, we told them in all of our documents, we sent them an end use certification, for example. Even if you don't require it from the regulations, just having them sign a document saying, here's who we are, here's what the product is, here's how we're going to use it, and here's where it's going to go, or we promise, cross our heart, hope to die, that these products are not going to end up places that they shouldn't be going. And that's really all you can do from a transaction perspective. You can't control the actions of people who want to break the law, people who want to go against our foreign policy and economic and national security objectives. They will find a way. BIS emphasized that right now we're trying to focus on slowing it down.
Well, I guess as we're looking at this, the other would be, again, reviewing this with your management team as they are then responsibility to make sure they are doing the things and reviews with their front line. Who's doing what, transacting that may come across pretty innocent, but something didn't quite add up, and there you go. So, okay. So, any other kinds of things here? We've been talking about this for a while. I guess we probably need to start looking at trying to wrap this up a little bit. But yeah, I'm telling you what, Lindsay,
much to cover. So much to cover. And I think, there are going to be even more updates after the election, no matter which way it goes. Things are going to change. They're going to continue changing. I can only imagine what 2025 update is going to look like. BIS has published a lot of their statements and their policies on their website. So if people are interested in new developments from them, they can go there. In fact, much to the frustration of all of us, one of the responses to a lot of our questions about what's going to happen is keep an eye out on our website. We'll let you know. So that's a good resource to look at.
Well, is this, would that be like bis.gov?
Yes. So specifically their press releases. I know, for example, that they just issued new semiconductor comments and corrections, which are of very much interest to people in that space. I don't think that made it out into their press release documents, but they have a email blast system. So does Treasury, that you can sign up for and get notifications about when they make changes.
Okay. Lindsay, I will say that we probably need to make sure that we get you back on, because there's a lot more we could probably zero in and narrow this down. Based on what I'm hearing, again, kind of recapping, is from BIS, obviously the scenario of the government agencies, the interdependency of each other on what's going on for enforcement, the international collaboration with probably other customs and probably government agencies, and they're going to be exchanging information, hence your data situation. Your internal things that you should be looking at, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, make sure you are doing the vetting of your customers, of your suppliers, of your current customers that you think, maybe they've popped up on the list and you don't know about it, and have multiple things there. Doing some recurrency training with folks, talking about the anti-boycott type requests and what does that mean and how do you incorporate that in. Folks, if you've got a company and you're doing business, let's say in Arkansas or Mississippi or down in Alabama or somewhere in some small little town, and you're doing some business, you may not think that somebody is reaching out to you in a nefarious manner, but hey, you're trying to get the business, you're trying to do something, and next thing you know, wham. As well as big companies and big corporations, your idea is to serve that customer, do everything you can. And yet at the same time, the intent is good by the front line. The oversight, management-wise, you guys folks need to be talking about this and whatnot. Anything else as far as actions that people need to be taken?
Keeping an eye on changes to sanctions and restricted parties lists, for sure. They are changing day by day. They will continue to do so as conflicts escalate, as the political environment changes, and as new technology develops. We can expect some more regulations. BIS previewed a new potential license exception that might be coming out.
What about as far as if I want to keep up to date with things? You just mentioned the BIS website. Obviously, I know that the Schultz Trade Law firm does post out some things. There's a lot of people posting things. But in particular, would you recommend it as far as, if you're in a particular industry, to reach out to some type of trade association that would be in your industry? Would that be a good way to keep up with this and let them do the work on?
Absolutely. Yes, industry partnerships, even compliance-related and import and export communities that do conferences and such. There are a wealth of resources of people in the business that just want to help. Talking to your business partners is a good one too, especially since they're potentially going to get rewarded for ratting you out. So maybe you all want to make sure that you're on the same page about what you're doing in terms of compliance and how best to address common issues that you have. The news is a good one because it'll help you anticipate changes that are going to happen. And of course, if you ever need help beyond your capability or find yourself in hot water, it's self-serving, right? But we always recommend reaching out to trade counsel or a consultant to help you get out of that.
These types of issues are not the things that you need to, navigate the law on your own. When you start getting into situations like that, don't be penny wise and pound foolish here. Reach out to an appropriate expert as you're going through that. So, well, Lindsay, I greatly appreciate you coming on and giving us a recap of BIS and the conference there. It sounds like it was well attended. Do you have any idea how many were there?
I can't remember the exact number, but because this was the first year since COVID, it was packed. They were sold out. Every room was full. Lots of people.
Well, folks, I will say that if there's anything that in particular comes up and you have a question, please reach out to us. Send us an email. Send us a message or something. and we can get you, we'll follow up. We'll get you the answers because we'll do some more of this. We're going to have some panel discussions. Folks, we'll just get with you and follow up to other shows. But for now, you have a great day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.